Toys R Us once sold 1 in every 5 toys in America. Over 1,500 stores, $13.5 billion in revenue. This was no dying brand. When it collapsed, most blamed Amazon, but 3 private equity firms had bought the company, loaded it with billions in debt, and extracted hundreds of millions of dollars in fees. Amazon did not destroy Toys R Us. To understand what did, you have to go back to the beginning. In 1948, on a quiet street in Washington, D.C., Charles Lazarus opened a small shop that sold baby furniture. He had just returned from World War II, watching a new generation of families fill the city with strollers and laughter. The store was called Children's Bargain Town, but Lazarus was already thinking bigger. Parents came for cribs and left asking about toys. He listened, rearranged his shelves, and soon the furniture made way for rows of playthings. By 1957, the store had a new name, Toys R Us. Lazarus didn't just sell toys, he invented a ritual. For many families, a trip to Toys R Us became a childhood milestone. The wide aisles, the endless shelves, the promise of something new around every corner. These weren't just retail features. They were the backdrop for birthdays, holiday mornings, and wish lists written in crayon. The store itself was a kind of theatre, where anticipation built with every step. Children would tug at their parents' sleeves, eyes wide, as they crossed under the bright blue pillars at the entrance. Inside, the world belonged to them. By the late 1970s, the company had gone public, and Lazarus was leading an expansion that seemed unstoppable. He introduced Geoffrey the giraffe in 1974, a mascot that would become as recognizable as any cartoon character. Geoffrey wasn't just a logo. He was a companion on the journey through the store, waving from signs, birthday banners, and the front of every weekly flyer. The experience was stitched together by a melody that would echo through generations. I don't want to grow up. I'm a Toys R Us kid. The jingle played on radios and televisions, in living rooms and car rides, embedding itself in the memory of millions. It wasn't just an advertisement, it was an invitation to stay young a little longer. For decades, shopping at Toys R Us was more than a transaction. It was a rite of passage, a promise that childhood could be found, aisle after aisle, in a place built just for kids. Charles Lazarus had created more than a store. He had built an institution. At its height, Toys R Us stood alone at the top of the toy industry. The numbers told a story of dominance that few retailers in any category could match. More than 1,500 stores stretched across the globe, including nearly 800 in the United States. In a single year, the company brought in $13.5 billion in revenue, an amount that dwarfed not only its direct competitors, but also many household names in American retail. According to Nielsen's market studies from the late 1990s, 1 out of every 5 toys sold in the United States passed through a Toys R Us register. That translated to a 20% share of the entire United States toy market, a figure unmatched by any rival then or since. The scale of the operation was staggering. During the holiday season, the company's sales would surge, with nearly half of its annual revenue coming in just a few short weeks. Stores would see foot traffic spike by more than 30%, turning each location into a hub of anticipation and celebration. The aisles weren't just filled with toys, they were lined with the hopes of millions of children, and the dreams of parents eager to deliver a little magic. Toys R Us didn't just outsell its competition, it outspent them too. The company's annual advertising budget eclipsed $300 million in the early 2000s, saturating television, radio, and print with the now iconic jingle and the ever-present face of Geoffrey the giraffe. Brand recognition soared, with surveys finding that more than 80% of children ages 5 to 12 could recall the jingle or mascot on command. No other toy retailer came close. The sheer volume of stores, the relentless marketing, and the deep supply chain built over decades made Toys R Us the gatekeeper of childhood in America. Its footprint was so vast, and its market power so complete that the idea of its disappearance would have seemed unthinkable. In every way that could be measured, whether sales, reach, or cultural presence, Toys R Us was not a business in decline. It was a giant at the peak of its power. In 2005, three powerful financial players, KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado Realty Trust, acquired Toys R Us for $6.6 billion. On paper, it looked like a bet on growth. In reality, the deal was built almost entirely on borrowed money. The private equity firms put up just over $1.3 billion in equity, leaving the company itself responsible for nearly $5 billion in new debt. Every year, Toys R Us was forced to pay between $400 million and $517 million in interest alone, a staggering sum that rivaled or even exceeded what it could spend on updating stores or building out its online presence. But debt payments were only part of the drain. The buyout agreement entitled the private equity owners to collect ongoing fees, so-called monitoring and advisory charges, regardless of how the business performed. Over the next decade, KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado extracted roughly $470 million in sponsor-related fees and payouts from Toys R Us. These payments were not bonuses for success. They were guaranteed, even as the company struggled to keep pace with a changing retail landscape. The result was a business that, despite massive sales and brand power, found itself shackled. Cash that should have gone towards store renovations, technology upgrades, or competitive pricing was instead routed to servicing debt and satisfying the demands of its new owners. Toys R Us was not failing because it lost relevance. It was being bled from within, each year forced to choose between survival and the obligations imposed by the buyout. The mechanics of the deal left little room for the company to adapt, invest, or even breathe. Internal memos from the final years tell the story of a company still generating hundreds of millions in operating profit, but locked in a financial cage. Every attempt to modernize, whether it was updating stores, improving websites, or expanding delivery options, ran into the same wall: debt obligations and restrictive covenants. Even as sales held steady, the cash needed for basic upgrades was redirected to lenders and private equity sponsors. By September 2017, the pressure finally broke the business. Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, not because it had lost its customers, but because it could no longer breathe under the weight of its debt. In the months that followed, the hope of reorganization faded. By June 2018, the company entered liquidation. More than 33,000 employees lost their jobs. There was no severance, no safety net, just a sudden end to decades of service. Store managers received the news by conference call. Workers packed up shelves for the last time, many leaving behind handwritten notes of thanks and apology to the families they had served. The collapse was not a slow decline, but a forced halt. The doors closed not from lack of demand, but from a business model that had been drained until nothing remained. For thousands of workers, the loss was more than a job. It was the erasure of a community and the end of a promise that had once defined childhood for generations. Blame for the fall of Toys R Us has often landed on Amazon, but the numbers tell a different story. While Amazon poured billions into new warehouses and technology, Toys R Us was locked out of making even basic investments. Year after year, debt service and private equity fees drained the cash that should have gone to store upgrades or digital investments. The company's annual capital expenditures fell far below what was needed to compete, not because executives lacked vision, but because the money simply wasn't there. As the end drew near, workers tried to make their voices heard. Reports circulated of a petition with nearly 50,000 signatures, demanding accountability from the company's owners and a measure of justice for those losing their livelihoods. No formal response ever came from the private equity sponsors. In congressional hearings, representatives called out the silence and the absence of responsibility. The workers' plea became a symbol, a reminder that behind every shuttered store stood thousands of families left with nothing. Meanwhile, Amazon's rise was not a retail death sentence. The company's massive reinvestment, over $16 billion in fulfillment infrastructure in a single year, stood in stark contrast to the constraints choking ToysRUs. The difference was not technology or customer loyalty, but the ability to invest for the future. ToysRUs was not outcompeted, it was outmaneuvered by a financial structure that left it unable to fight. The myth that Amazon killed ToysRUs lets those truly responsible off the hook. The facts point elsewhere, to boardrooms, to balance sheets, and to the decision to treat a beloved brand as a short-term asset rather than a lasting trust. Today, the empty aisles of once bustling toy palaces remind us that even cultural giants fall to forces beyond competition. When institutions built on childhood wonder disappear overnight, it exposes just how fragile beloved traditions can be. The legacy endures, in memory and in the cautionary lessons left behind.